To my YouTube channel, Netty the Coder. Today we're going to be talking about functions in JavaScript. What are functions? How do we use them in JavaScript? Before diving into the lecture, please make sure you watch the previous lectures on JavaScript in order to follow along the tutorial. Yeah, let's just get started with the functions. Functions are main building blocks of the program. They allow code to be called many times without repetition. So don't just, compare it with the loops that we just discussed in the previous lecture. Functions are something else. So functions are basically, some block of code that you want to execute again and again, but you don't want to repeat the code. Quite often we need to perform a similar action in many places of the script. For example, we need to show a nice looking message when a visitor logs in, logs out, or maybe, somewhere else. So that's kind of a practical example. We have already seen examples of built-in functions like alert, prompt, and confirm in JavaScript. So these kind of functions, these are built-in JavaScript functions that we just played around, and if we pass a message to this, and then it performs certain actions. But what we are doing here is we're just calling this function. We didn't define the functions ourselves, but yeah, this is the way it works. We can also create functions of our own as well. So yeah, instead of using the built-in function of JavaScript like alert, prompt, confirm, and many more, we can also create our own functions. Function declaration. How do we should know how to declare a function. To declare a function to create a function, we can use a function declaration. The function keyword goes first, then goes the name of the function, then a list of the parameters between the parentheses, comma separated. At last, the code body of the function between the curly braces. To call the declare function, use the function name followed by the parentheses. So yeah, let's just see it in action, input, how it works. So yeah, I'll just clear up this crap from the previous video. And so first of all, we discussed that we will be using the function keyword, okay, written down to JavaScript, and then goes the function name. For example, we can name it hello world. This is our function name. This is the function declaration, then followed by the parentheses, and then goes the function body. For now, we're not going to be talking about the parameters, but we'll just say we'll just create our function using the keyword, and then followed by the function name, then the parentheses. This is compulsory, you have to do that. And then the function body, it actually tells you what is the body, what is the block of code that you want to execute inside this function. So this is how we do function declaration. And inside you can write any code, any type of code that you want. But for now, we'll just, console log a message. For example, hello world from a function, from a function, or from the function, I'll say. Alrighty. So yeah, this is how it works. So now what happens? We have written our first function and defined our first function. So how to call this function now? For example, I save the file, I refresh it, nothing happens. No, the console message is not there. Even I wrote that. In order to execute this block of code, you have to call this function, and the way to call this function is to use the function name. And for example, if I want to call this function, I have to do write the function name and then followed by parentheses. This is the way to call function. So it happens that whenever you see this kind of thing, and a name of a function followed by this parenthesis, it means execute this function for me on my need base wherever I want. Okay, so this happens now, and when I save the file and refresh, you can see hello world from the function. So now the function is executed, and we can call the function as many times as we want. So yeah, this would work as well. You can see the message for 5 times. So because we're calling this function for 5 times. So yeah, this block of code is executed 5 times. We're calling this function 5 times. So this is useful in scenarios like, for example, you have certain block of code that you want to execute in different places and you don't want to repeat your code. For example, this is a message you want to put a hello world message in many different places, but you don't want to write console log a hello message. This is a very simple example. This is just one line of code, but in real world you have, for example, 1000 line of code, or we would say that for example 50 lines of code. You just have to write a function for that, and then you can just call it anywhere you want. So this is very useful in that scenarios. I can refresh and you can see the function has been called. So yeah, to call the declared function, use the function name followed by the parentheses, and it will call your function, which will execute the code of the function. So basically the body of the function, this is what we call the body of the function. This will be executed when we call the function. If we ever need to change the message or the way it is shown, it is enough to modify the code in one place, the function which outputs it. So yeah, this is the core idea of writing your function. So for example, if you're calling this function in multiple places, okay, and it's not just one place that you're calling the function. If, for example, you're calling this function in 100 places, so you don't need to go to that 100 places and change your code, because you have wrote your function in one place, and you can just modify this code, and wherever you're calling your function, you'll see the change over there. The message will be the same whatever you put in the original function. So yeah, this is the basic use case of that. Now let's talk about local variables. A variable declared inside a function is only visible inside that function. It cannot be accessed outside the function. So yeah, let's just see what is a local variable. What is a variable first? We already know what is a variable. For example, I have a variable we declared with the let keyword, and I have a variable name. For example, it's called name, and then I have a value for that. So what happens? What is a local variable now? So a variable that we declare inside a function, it's called a local variable. Why it is local? Because this variable is accessible only inside this body of the function, only inside this function. For example, if I want to try to print this name, I won't be able to do this, but I can do that here because this function body has access to this. It is between these curly braces. It is inside the body of this function, but I cannot access it from outside. So let's see it in action. When I do this, you can see hello world from the function, and then the name. It's called John, and it's not printing out anything for the name. So yeah, this is how it really works. So we don't have anything for that, but yeah, we do have the name output over here because it is known to this function, and it knows what is a name, so it knows it. Outer variables that resides outside the function body, or are called outer variables. A function can access an outer variable. A function has full access to the outer variable. It can modify it as well. The outer variable is only used if there is no local one. Okay, we can also access outer variables from here. For example, let's say I have a variable called first name equal John, okay, and then I'll just change it to last name. I can access this outside of the function, you can see over here, but even inside I can do hello. Okay, I'll just change it to backticks, and for example, I want to print it nicely. Hello first name, then space, and then last name. And I'll just get rid of the name over here, and you can see that, okay, I can access it from here. So I'll just change it to Doe, John Doe, and for now I'll just comment it out just to make the message cleaner. So what happens over here, this function, this variable is the outer variable, but this function, inside this function we can have access to it. So let's see it in action. We refresh the page, you can see hello John Doe. The first name is coming from the outer variable and the second name is coming from the inner variable. The fun part is even we can modify the variable through the function. For example, I would say something like, okay, I don't want the first name to be John. I would say that the first name should be Jen, or the first name should be, for example, Jackson. Okay, and when I save it and refresh, you can see that we have modified the external variable or from the inner variable. What happens if we print out the first name now? So what you will see it now. You can see the John is, we still see on line number 22 that John is printed over here. You'll be a bit confused about this because you can see that hello Jackson Doe is printed out on the second line, and then John is on the printed on the first line because of the order of the order we are calling the function. So we're calling the first name first, and we're printing the first name value first, and we're calling the function after this. If we do it like this, for example, so now we are calling the function first and the modification happens here. What happens if we call this function now? So you can see hello Jackson Jackson Dove, sorry, and then you can see the value of Jackson. So on line number 22, we are getting the modified value of the first name because this value has been modified by this function. The first name is modified by this function, and we're printing it here as well. But it also affects the outer variable. So this is how we can modify the outer variable in a function. Yeah, if a same name variable it's a note. If a same name variable is declared inside the function, then it shadows the outer one and the outer one is ignored. So let's say we have another variable with the same variable name, okay, and we have declared it inside the function. What happens now? So when I save it and refresh, you can see hello Jackson Doe. Okay, that is correct, but we are getting John. So it means it's not modifying the outer variable anymore. So what happens is we have an outer variable over here with the variable name first name, and we have the same variable name inside the function we have declared, but with different value in here. So this is a local variable, okay? So once we have this kind of scenario, we have an outer variable and inside we have this the inner variable with the same variable name, then the outer variable is not executed. It is ignored by the function. So basically we call it that this variable name shadows the other one and executes the local variable instead of the outer variable. So the first name here that you're seeing the value from is this one, and the last name is from this one, and the first name that we are executing over here is the outer variable over here. So we are printing out John, but inside the function we are calling the first name which is declared over here. So this is how it really works. If the same named variable is declared inside a function, then it shadows the outer variable, and the outer variable is ignored, and it takes in the inner variable that we have declared. What are global variables? We just talked about local variables, outer variables, global variables. Variables declared outside of any functions are called global variables. So basically the outer variables are actually the global variables. Global variables are visible from any function unless shadowed by locals. So in this case we have a first name. This is basically the global variable. So this function have access to this global variable unless shadowed by an internal variable with the same name. So yeah, it is a good practice to minimize the use of global variables because, for example, I have a lot of functions that has access to this outer variable. So if for example I mistakenly modified one function the outer variable, then it will be we will see the effect in all of these functions, and that might not be expected. So it is a good practice to minimize the use of global variables and make use of local variables. Means to declare variable inside the function. Parameters. Let's talk about parameters. What are parameters? We can pass arbitrary data to the functions using parameters. When the function is called, the passed values are copied to the local variables, then the function uses them. So basically, we can pass parameters to the function. For example, let's say we have a scenario. We can say first name and last name. Let's say we are using, we don't want to use Jackson Doe. So since the purpose of a function is to execute a block of code and, do not repeat it. But a function is more of a generic solution or more of a generic block of code that you write sometimes. And for example, you want to pass the first name and last name to the function, and you want a function to print. For example, the purpose of this function is to print the first name and last name with a hello string. Okay, so you just greet a person with the first name and last name, but this cannot be a case that the value should not always be Jackson Doe. So for example, there is a new visitor on your website and you want to greet the user, then it might be a case that you cannot call a person with Jackson Doe. Okay, maybe someone's name is something else. For example, someone is John Doe, someone is Jackson Doe, someone is Jan, or whatever name. So people have different names. You can call everyone with the same name. So for that reason, we want to go with a generic solution. In that case, we make use of parameters. This is just a use case of that. So for example, I pass the first name and last name as a parameter to these functions, to this function. So in this case, I can make use of this. So I'll say first name equal first name, last name equal to last name. So what happens here is when I call this function, I have to pass first name, for example, Jackson, and the last name should be Dante. So this is basically the first name and last name. We are passing it to this function now. And this first name will be copied to the local variables. So basically this is the local variable, and then we are printing out these variables, first name and the last name. And where the values are coming from, this is the value that is taking the value from it. So the value we are passing whenever we are calling the function. So between the parentheses, we can pass the arguments, and this will be copied into the local variables over here, and we can just print them. For example, when I save it, it will print out, sorry, now first name has already been declared. Let's just there is an error because the first name, we have first name over here and the first name as well. So simply we can get rid of these two, or we can change them to something else. So for now, I'll just put the first name and last name over here like this, and I can still print out the message over here. Yeah, you can see hello Jackson Dante. What happens if I'll just do this for now. So what happens, I call it with a different name. For example, I say Jan Doe. Okay, so now I'm calling this function with different arguments, and then calling again this function with different arguments. So now it's a very generic solution. So you can see hello Jackson Dante and hello Jan Doe. So basically we are calling this function for different purposes now, for different users now. So this is the way we can make this function more generic and control it with the parameters. So yeah, we can also get rid of this and just simply directly pass this value in here. So you can save it again, and you can refresh, and you can make use of it. But sometimes we need to, for example, I don't want to do this, and sometimes I do some evaluation. For example, instead of first name and last name, we are going to be passing, for example, some numbers, and then we do multiplication on that number, for example, or addition on that number, and then store it in a variable and do this and assign it to, and pass it to the print it. So for now, I can also do, for example, fn. I'll just do, for example, first and underscore name, and then I can do last name. So yeah, this is how it really works. So you can just do this instead of the underscore, and yeah, this would work as well. But you can also directly do this, and this should work without the initialization part. So this is not necessary because it is already doing it here. We're already doing it here. So it basically means that whenever this function is called, so it's basically declaring a variable for you, but we do need to write the let keyword over here, and we don't need to specify the type over here as well, because JavaScript is not statically typed. So we can do something like this. But yeah, if you have a use case and you want to manipulate the first name, for example, or do something else with the first name and last name, then you can, and you want to reinitialize it to a variable, then you can do that as well. But if not, you can just get rid of this and print out the message. But for now, we'll just keep it. When a value is passed as a function parameter, it is also called an argument. So what we just talked about two terminologies over here, parameters and arguments. What was the difference? So sorry, I just went ahead. A parameter is a variable listed inside the parentheses in the function declaration. It is a declaration time term. An argument is the value that is passed to the function when it is called. It is a call time term. So basically, a parameter, the small difference is whenever we are calling or declaring the function. So in this case, these two variables are called the parameters, or between these parentheses during the declaration of this function, they're called parameters. But when you are calling this function and you're passing the actual values to the function, we call it arguments. So this is a little bit of the difference that you may need to keep in mind. If someone asks you, or maybe in some interviews, you're asked what is the difference between arguments and parameters. But sometimes, most of the time, people use it interchangeably. But yeah, this is the core difference between them. So for during the declaration, the parameter they're called parameters between the parentheses. During the call time, whenever you're calling the function, they're called arguments. So yeah, this is the core difference. Default values. If a function is called but an argument is not provided, then the corresponding values become undefined. We can specify the so-called default to use if emitted value for a parameter in the function declaration using this. Okay, so what is a default value? Let's say we are calling this hello world function, okay, and we are not passing, for example, the last name over here. Since it is expecting the two values over here, the first name and the last name, but in the first function call, we are not passing any value. So in this case, the last name will become undefined, and let's see in action and see how it really works. So you can see hello Jackson undefined because it doesn't know the last name in the first call, but in the second call, we're passing the last name, so it knows that it's a string. It's called Doe. So what happens now? So this is a very simple case that we are not passing the value, and we know that we're not passing the value. But sometimes you are getting the data from somewhere else, and you can expect that the user may not pass a value to the function. Then in that case, we make use of a default value, which means that if this value is undefined, if it is no value, then you can just make, for example, you can say unknown. Okay, this is the default value. If the last name is undefined, then you can say then the default value should be unknown. Or if the first name is not defined, or if it is not passed as an argument to the function, then in this case it could be unknown. Okay, we can just make it more explicit. We can call it unknown first name and unknown last name. When I save the file and I refresh the page, you can see hello Jackson unknown last name because we did not pass any last name. Or what if we don't pass the first name as well? So we can see here. So now we won't get any undefined. We can see hello unknown first name, unknown last name, because this is the default value that we expect to be printed. So in this case, it won't break the code, or if you have some certain calculations or something like that. So you can pass a default value like this, and it will, print. If this is not defined, then it will print out this value for you. If it is defined, sorry, I did it mistakenly, I think. If this is defined, for example, John Doe, and you print the value, you can see hello John Doe, hello Jan Doe, and now it's not printing any of the default values. So this is how it works in JavaScript. Example is this: you can define a function name, then the parameter value, and you can initialize it with the default value. If it, in case it is undefined, then this will go. Several years ago, JavaScript did not support the syntax for default parameters, so people used other ways of specifying them. For example, this. So a few years back, this is basically supported in a newer version of JavaScript. So a few years back, people used to check if the value is not defined. So for example, if I do something like this, and I'll get rid of this. So just to make this clear to you guys. So for example, a few years back, it was not supported like this to write, a default value like this during the declaration. So in the body, they had some extra checks for that. For example, if first name is not equal to, or we can say equal to undefined. If it is undefined and it's not passed, then the first name should be, so the default value should be unknown, or we can say the default first name, okay? And if also the last name is not defined, then we can say default last name. So let's see if it works out. So for example, if I just refresh it, I'm getting the same values. What if I don't pass the last name over here in this function? Okay, and refresh it. Yeah, you can see default last name. So a few years back, people used to work it out like this, but now we have a more short and elegant way of doing this. So we no longer have to do this, but instead we can just take it like this and put it in front of the variable name, and we don't have to do the extra checks for that. We don't have to write the if statements for all of the parameters. So we may have, for example, 5 parameters or 10 parameters to pass to the functions. So in that case, we want to avoid the if else statement. So that's why. But in the modern JavaScript now, it is supported, and we can write in front of this. So yeah, this is how it works right now. Returning a value. So a function is doing some certain calculation, and for example, we have a case that we want to pass some values to a function, and it does some certain operations on that value, and then we don't want the function to print the value inside that function, but we want that function to return that value to us, and we can assign that value to a variable or something like that. A function can return a value back into the calling code as a result. Example is like this. For example, we have a function and we pass it two parameters a and b, and we return the sum of these numbers. Okay, the directory return can be in any place of the function. It can return when the execution reaches it, the function stops and the value is returned to the calling code. Let's see it in action. I'll just comment this out and I'll show you how it really works. Okay, so for example, let's suppose we have a function, and the job of the function is to add two numbers. Okay, and what we can do is we can pass two variables to it. For example, num1 and num2. These are the two numbers that we are passing to this function, and now we have to declare the variable as the body of the function. Okay, and this function will just do, for example, console log num1 plus num2. Okay, this will work now. So to call this function, we can just do we can write a name of the function. We can pass the values to the function. Now, for example, we want to add two numbers like 1 and 2. When we pass these two numbers to this function, it will just catch it there, and we will just sum them up and just print them over here. So yeah, when I go to this page and refresh, you can see 3 as an output. It is expected because we are passing 1 and 2. For example, we pass 5 and 2, then it will sum these numbers and save print them. So let's say we don't want the function to print it really, but I want this function to return it. What if, but before going there, can I do something like this? For example, let's say I want to store the result of the sum of these two numbers into a variable. Yes, actually we can do that. But what happens if I do it like this now? And I do this. So yeah, it is printing out the message. What if I console log the result? Okay, and I refresh. You can see undefined because the function is actually printing the value, but it's not returning anything to us that I can assign to this variable. So to return actually the value, we can make use of a return statement, that is this. And I can say, okay, don't print the number, actually just sum them up and return it to me. Or if I don't want to return directly the number, I can also assign it to, for example, a constant or a lit, whatever. We can say sum, add these two numbers, assign it to a variable, and then return that variable. We can do it that way as well, but whatever is your preference. But more preferably people do, in a short way. And yeah, that's the short way to do it. But yeah, for now we'll just do it like this. And if I refresh, you can see 7 that has been returned on line number 22. So you can see line number 22, we have the value of result printed. So what happens is this function is called, we are passing these two values. Okay, sum these two numbers for me. So this function is called, they are copied to this variable, they are summed up, they're assigned to this variable, and then returned by this function. So yeah, this is how a function can return a value, and we can assign it to the calling function. And this is assigned to the result. Now this result variable, the result is stored in this variable, and we can print the result that we just saw. So yeah, there may be many occurrences of return in a single function based on conditions. So we can say, for example, we can also put some certain conditions over here. We can say, for example, if num1 or we can say something like this, for example. If sum is equal to this, then return sum, or otherwise return 100 or whatever we want to return. Okay, we'll get rid of this for now. So we can also have multiple return statements. This is the concept I want to clarify to you guys. So basically, for example, we want to call this function, we're passing these two numbers, and we are doing some operation, we're doing the sum. If the sum is greater than 10, then return the sum, otherwise return 100. This is just some arbitrary value that I came up with and passed it. So what will happen now? So it is printing out 100 because the second condition is true, because the sum is not greater than 10. It is basically 5 plus 2 equals 7. So this is not returning the actual value. What happens if we pass, for example, 10 over here? So 10 plus 2 equals 12. So this condition will be true. It should return 12 instead of 100. So you can see 12 is returned now. So this is how we can have multiple return statements based on some conditions. A function with an empty return or without it returns undefined. So yeah, so if we have we don't specify any return statement that we just saw. If we don't specify any return statement in the function, and for example we just do console log some whatever we want to do, or even if we don't do any operations over here, so the functions by default will return an undefined value. So if I refresh it, you can see undefined is returned. It just printed out the value over here on line number 18, but it just returned undefined in the result, and undefined is assigned to the result. So yeah, note, never add a new line between the return and the value. For a long expression return, it might be tempting to put it on a separate line, but yeah, you can just make use of the parentheses. So for example, let's say we have a condition, we are doing something like this, for example, and we are returning the sum. If we do this, for example, we put a new line after the return statement, then it will not return the expected result. It will return undefined, because JavaScript by default is expecting that return a semicolon if you have a new line after the return. So it's not the correct way of doing this. But if you have, for example, a long expression like this, for example, number plus 10 minus 10 divided by 10 divided by 1 or whatever, and then multiply by 176 and then a remainder 67 and all that, and you have, for example, a long list of operations over here, then you can just make use of this and it should work for you as well. So now if you do this and you do, for example, this, and then go to a new line and you just go ahead with this, so this will work as well for you in that case. So you just have to put it in parentheses, but the parentheses should be on the exact line of the return statement, then it will work. Otherwise it won't work and it will return some unexpected values for you. Now it is returning after the operations, it is returning the value for. So yeah, this is something to be kept in mind. Naming a function. How do we name a function? Actually, functions are actions, so their name is usually a verb. Okay, so functions actually perform some certain actions, so their name should be a verb. It should be as brief, as accurate as possible, and describe what the function actually does, so that someone reading the code gets an indication of what the function actually does. It is a widespread practice to start a function with a verbal prefix which vaguely describe the action. For example, functions that start with show usually show something or print something. For example, if we have the function name over here, add two numbers, so it's quite descriptive. That it means that this function is adding two numbers, so it means that this function must be expecting two numbers as parameters, or we have some values over here, for example 1 plus 2 already hard-coded, and we don't necessarily need to pass the values over here, and we can sum them up. It will return the sum of that two numbers. So yeah, this is how a function name should be more descriptive. So, and for example, we have a prefix of get, so it means that it will return a value to us. Calculate, calc, so it means that calculate something. Create means create something. So this is how we can prefix the function names, just to make them more explicit, and so it is more definitive or descriptive in terms of the name. Best practices. With prefixes in place, a glance at a function name gives you an understanding of what kind of work it does and what kind of value it returns. One function, one action. Don't make a function to do multiple actions. So per function, it should do exactly one thing. For example, here we have a function add two numbers. Okay, so we cannot do something like, okay, let's just find out subtract, and we can do, for example, num1 minus num2. So this shouldn't be the case. So in order to do this, exactly for this case, we are expecting this function to do addition and not subtraction. So for this case, we should have another function, and we can call it, function subtract two numbers. Okay, and it will be expecting two values, and for example num1 and num2, and it will have a certain body, and it will return these values. So if you want to do subtraction over here, we should have a separate function for that. So each function should have one action per function. So yeah, two independent actions usually deserve two functions even if they are usually called together. Example is get age should just get you the age. Create password should just create a password. Check permission should just check the permission for you and not do anything else. Functions equal comments. What does it mean? Functions should be short and do exactly one thing. If that thing is big, maybe it's worth to split the function into few smaller functions. Sometimes following this rule may not be that easy, but it is definitely a good thing to do. Why? Because a separate function is not only easier to test and debug, its very existence is a great comment. So by the function name, whatever we name the function, we directly know that, okay, this function does addition of two numbers. This function takes two numbers and subtracts them. So this is basically, we don't need to write some extra comments for that. Okay, a few lines of comments on that. Okay, we are passing these numbers and then do the subtraction, then return that. Simply the names are basically more descriptive and we don't need comments for this. So that's why we say functions are equal to comments. So if you name your functions in a better way, then it's more descriptive and people understand it quite well. Example is show prime, s prime, etc. The end of this lecture. And we have learned so far the functions, how we define function, how we declare functions, what are declarative functions, and how we pass parameters to the functions. What is the difference between parameters and arguments and all that. I hope you have learned something new in this video. Please like and share this video, subscribe to the channel, and make sure to press the bell icon for future updates. And until then, I'll see you in the next lecture.